The walls of Tortosa were strong, its towers were intact, its soldiers were ready. By the logic of medieval warfare, this city should have survived, but this siege was never decided by steel, ladders, or siege towers. It was decided by water. Outside the walls stood an attacking force that knew a brutal truth. They could not break Tortosa by force. Every assault would fail. Every charge would bleed them dry. Inside the city, confidence still held, because Tortosa believed it was secure. Its wells were deep. Its stores were stocked. As long as water flowed, the city could endure anything. Then a decision was made, a decision so disturbing that chroniclers struggled to describe it without horror, a tactic that required no breach, no victory on the battlefield, and no mercy. Dead bodies were gathered, not buried, not burned, but carried deliberately toward the city's lifeline. Within days, the strongest defenses in the region became meaningless. Within weeks, Tortosa began to collapse from the inside. This was not a battle of knights and swords. This was medieval biological warfare, long before anyone knew what disease truly was. And once the water turned against them, the fall of Tortosa became inevitable. The Siege of Tortosa did not begin with panic. It began with confidence. Tortosa was a coastal stronghold built for endurance. Its stone walls rose thick and high, designed to resist rams, ladders, and fire. Watchtowers overlooked both land and sea, giving defenders early warning of any approach. But the city's true strength lay beneath the streets. Deep wells cut into bedrock generations earlier fed Tortosa with fresh water even during prolonged sieges. In medieval warfare, this single advantage often decided everything. Food could be rationed. Soldiers could rotate shifts. But without water, the city died quickly. Tortosa believed it was prepared. Outside the walls, the besieging force faced a different reality. They were determined, but limited. They lacked the numbers for repeated assaults. They lacked the siege engines required to shatter walls at speed. Every attempt to test the defenses ended the same way. Arrows from the ramparts, stones from above, and men carried back bleeding. The commanders did the calculations. Storming the walls would cost more lives than they could afford. Waiting would drain their own supplies first. Relief forces were unlikely to arrive in time for either side. The mathematics were impossible. By every accepted rule of medieval warfare, this siege should have failed. Inside Tortosa, life continued under strain, but not terror. Guards remained disciplined. Civilians queued at wells with guarded patience. Children were kept indoors. The air smelled of salt, stone dust, and too many bodies packed too tightly together, but not yet of fear. The defenders believed time favored them. What they did not fully understand was how narrow their margin truly was. Medieval cities lived permanently close to disease. Waste flowed through streets. Animals shared space with people. Illness was a constant, familiar threat. What kept that threat contained was clean water. The commanders outside Tortosa understood this, not through science but through experience. They had seen camps collapse when water sources failed. They had watched armies dissolve without ever meeting an enemy blade. Disease was unpredictable, but when it came fast. As the days passed and options disappeared, the besiegers stopped discussing ladders and rams. They stopped talking about breaches and charges. Instead, they began asking a different question. Not how to enter the city, but how to make the city destroy itself. Once that thought took hold, the Siege of Tortosa changed forever, because the attackers realized they did not need to break the walls. They only needed access to the one thing the city could not live without. Outside Tortosa, the siege settled into a tense rhythm. No horns sounded, no banners advanced. The attackers conserved strength and watched the city breathe. Day by day, hour by hour, they learned its habits. Which gates opened at dawn? Which streets filled first? Which wells drew the longest lines? This was no longer about breaking stone. It was about understanding dependence. Inside the city, pressure accumulated quietly. Crowds thickened near water points as families filled containers more often than before. Guards tried to maintain order, but arguments flared. brief, sharp, then gone. Everyone felt the strain, even if no one named it. The city council debated rationing. Some argued it was too early. Others warned that once panic began, it could not be reversed. They chose delay. As long as the wells worked, restraint seemed unnecessary. But medieval cities were fragile ecosystems. Waste moved through open channels. Animals were slaughtered nearby. Rain washed filth toward low ground. Clean water was the thin barrier holding disaster back. Outside the walls, the besieging commanders faced their own division. A withdrawal was discussed, quietly, reluctantly. Some insisted that honor demanded one final assault. Others knew what the casualty lists would look like. Then a different proposal surfaced. It was not shouted. It did not inspire confidence. It produced silence. Those who had seen sieges before understood immediately. They had witnessed camps die when streams were fouled by accident. They had watched sickness spread when latrines overflowed into water sources. If contamination could happen by chance, it could happen by design. The discussion was brief but heavy. No one pretended this was honorable. No one celebrated the idea, but siege warfare was never clean. As days passed, the choice hardened into decision. The attackers began gathering what the siege had already produced. The dead, men killed in skirmishes, animals that had perished from exhaustion, anything that carried decay. These were not displayed. They were not used for intimidation. They were handled quietly, methodically. Under darkness, small teams moved closer to the city's lifelines. They avoided torchlight. They avoided noise. There was no ceremony to it, only completion. Inside Tortosa, nothing changed that night. Water still flowed. Buckets were filled. Orders were issued and obeyed. But the balance had shifted. What the defenders believed was endurance had become exposure. The city still stood. Its walls were untouched. Its gates remained closed. Yet the countdown had begun, not to an assault, but to something far worse. And by the time the first signs appeared, there would be no way to undo what had already entered the wells. At first, the city noticed nothing unusual. The water drawn from the wells looked the same. It was clear. It was cool. It tasted no different than it had the day before. Guards drank from it on the walls. Mothers boiled it for children. Merchants mixed it into food and drink. For a brief moment, Tortosa believed it had survived another night. Then the sickness appeared. It did not arrive as a wave. It crept. A dock worker collapsed near the harbor, clutching his stomach. 2 soldiers reported fever by midday. A child vomited repeatedly after drinking from a public well. These things were not unusual during sieges. Illness was common. Healers blamed heat, spoiled food, exhaustion. No alarms were raised. By the second day, patterns emerged. Entire households fell ill at once. Men who had never shared meals weakened within hours of each other. The sick complained of burning thirst, but drinking only made the pain worse. Whispers spread before orders could. People began avoiding certain wells. Crowds shifted to others. Guards tried to redirect lines, but discipline was already thinning. The city's healers were overwhelmed. They burned herbs. They bled patients. They prayed. Nothing slowed the spread. By the third day, fear replaced confusion. Soldiers abandoned posts to search for uncontaminated water. Arguments turned violent at wellheads. Buckets were overturned, deliberately to stop others from drinking. Inside the command chambers, officers faced an impossible choice. If they closed the wells, dehydration would cripple the city within days. If they left them open, the sickness would continue unchecked. There was no third option. Outside the walls, the attackers observed the change. They saw fewer guards on the ramparts. They noticed delays in responses. They smelled smoke from hurried cremations rising behind the walls. They did not advance. They did not need to. Inside Tortosa, death accelerated. The sick could no longer be isolated. The dead could no longer be buried properly. Waste piled faster than it could be removed. The city began poisoning itself. Morale collapsed before command did. Soldiers questioned orders openly. Civilians ignored rationing entirely. The wells, once symbols of survival, became places of dread. People approached them reluctantly. Some refused water altogether, but thirst always won. By the end of the week, Tortosa was still standing, yet it was no longer defending itself. It was unraveling. The besiegers had not breached a gate. They had not fired a single decisive volley, and still the city was losing. The mathematics of warfare had shifted again. Time was no longer neutral. It was a weapon, and with every passing hour, that weapon cut deeper, from the inside out. By the second week, Tortosa was no longer fighting a siege. It was fighting itself. The walls still stood. The gates were still barred, but the routines that kept a city alive were breaking down. Guards missed rotations. Orders were repeated and ignored. Messages took longer to move through the streets because messengers were sick, exhausted, or simply gone. The wells were now the center of every decision. Some were sealed by order of the city council. Others were guarded day and night. A few were secretly reopened by desperate civilians after dark. None of it mattered. Water drawn earlier had already been stored in homes, kitchens, and barracks. Contamination did not need access to every well. It only needed time. Commanders inside Tortosa tried to regain control through authority. They issued strict rationing orders. They threatened punishment for disobedience. Fear answered back. Civilians stopped trusting officials who could not explain the sickness. Soldiers listened less carefully to men who looked as weak as they felt. Outside the walls, the attackers understood the moment they had reached. They did not prepare ladders. They did not roll forward siege engines. Instead, they tightened the perimeter. Supply lines were cut completely. Movement in and out of the city stopped. No one was allowed to leave. Then came the psychological blow. Word was allowed to spread. Prisoners were released. Rumors were not denied. The truth that the wells had been deliberately fouled found its way inside the city. Panic accomplished what disease alone could not. Some civilians refused water entirely, choosing dehydration over sickness. Others drank recklessly, hoping for luck rather than safety. Fights broke out at guarded wells as families tried to secure one last clean draw. Attempts were made to dig new wells inside the city. The effort failed. The rock was too hard. The time was gone. The decisive moment did not come with a battle. It came with silence. Sections of the wall went unmanned. Signal horns went unanswered. For the first time since the siege began, Tortosa stopped reacting. The attackers advanced cautiously. Not in force, but in confidence. There was no resistance. The city had already fallen in every way that mattered. This was the true breakthrough, not tactical genius on the battlefield, but the complete collapse of a system that could no longer sustain life. Steel never tested the walls. Fire never reached the gates. Yet Tortosa was defeated, because once water became a threat, instead of a refuge, no defense could compensate. And from that moment forward, the end was no longer in question, only how much suffering would precede it. When the collapse finally became undeniable, the walls of Tortosa were still intact, but the city behind them was finished. There was no single moment historians could point to and call the fall. No dramatic surrender scene, no last stand worthy of legend. Instead, Tortosa failed in fragments. Entire streets fell silent, as families barricaded themselves indoors. Barracks emptied because soldiers were too weak to stand. Orders continued to be issued long after anyone was able to obey them. The dead were everywhere. At first, bodies were removed quickly, carried to pits outside living areas. But soon there were too many. Burials slowed, then stopped. The sick lay beside the dead, indistinguishable by nightfall. Medieval chroniclers tried to record what followed, but their numbers cannot be trusted. Some claimed tens of thousands were affected. Others wrote only that the city emptied faster than it could be buried. What remains consistent is this: far more people died from sickness than from combat. That was the true butcher's bill. The attackers did not escape unscathed. Handling decomposing bodies spread illness through their own camps. The ground around Tortosa became contaminated. Nearby water sources were ruined, sometimes for years. Victory poisoned the land, as well as the enemy. 3 consequences followed almost immediately. First, strategic damage. The city that had been worth capturing was now barely usable. Trade halted. Population collapsed. Second, moral recoil. Even in an age accustomed to brutality, this method unsettled observers. Some chroniclers condemned it outright. Others described it cautiously, as if afraid the words themselves carried disease. Third, and most dangerous precedent. The Siege of Tortosa proved that a city could be destroyed without conquest, that walls were meaningless. If water could be turned against those inside, that patience could outperform bravery. Other commanders took note, not because the tactic was admired, but because it worked. The attackers gained control of Tortosa, but at the cost of transforming warfare itself. The siege left behind more than a broken city. It left a lesson that could not be unlearned. And once that lesson entered military thinking, no well, no spring, no city water source could ever be seen as neutral again. The Siege of Tortosa was not remembered for a battle. It was remembered for a realization that a city could be defeated without its walls ever failing. Medieval commanders did not understand bacteria or infection. They had no concept of germs, but they understood patterns, cause and effect, written in suffering. They had seen armies collapse after drinking from fouled streams. They had watched camps disappear when sickness spread faster than discipline. At Tortosa, that knowledge was no longer accidental. It was applied. After the siege, water changed status in warfare. Wells were guarded like gates. Springs were treated as strategic assets. Cities began planning not just for hunger, but for contamination. The tactic was rarely celebrated. It carried no glory, no songs were written about it, but it was remembered because it worked. That is what makes Tortosa disturbing even now, not the cruelty alone, but the efficiency. The siege revealed a truth that still echoes through history. War does not always reward courage or honor. Sometimes, it rewards whoever is willing to weaponize survival itself. Tortosa did not fall when its defenses were breached. It fell when its most basic necessity became a liability. When the water, once a promise of endurance, turned into a source of death, the outcome was sealed long before surrender was spoken. That is why the Siege of Tortosa still matters. It stands as one of the earliest reminders that the most dangerous weapons are not always forged in fire or steel. Sometimes they flow quietly from a well.